Today. This session is on faculty success off the tenure track, and my name is Laura Schramm. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. And just to give a little bit of framing about this session, we often hear and even have had some professional development events about things like alternative academic careers or tenure track careers. And we often hear a lot of conversation, especially in the press, about contingent faculty. So we hear about those kind of three areas, but our panel today kind of goes beyond those simplistic categories, I think. And our panel consists of scholars who have found success as faculty off the tenure track. And I'm going to start just by asking them to share what their work is and what kind of various things that they do so that you all can get a sense of the variety of their experiences on the panel. So maybe I'll just ask Carolyn if you want to start and just share. I should say, and I'm not sure if our panelists know this, but you all have in your packets brief bios of each of our panelists, but I am going to invite them to share a little bit about their current position and what they do in those roles. Thanks.
My name is Carolyn Kranz, and I am an assistant research scientist at University of Michigan. I'll explain what that was, because I think when I was in your position, I didn't actually know that position existed. So Michigan, University of Michigan, and actually a lot of big research schools have tenure tracks, obviously, but then they have a research track. So I'm research faculty at U of M, and so my appointment is fully on research grants. The college doesn't supply any money to my position. We joke that as long as we bring in the money, they'll pay us with it. So the university will pay us with it. But it's a fantastic position. I really love it. I get to do research, which I love doing. That's why I got my PhD. I got my PhD from U of M in applied physics too, by the way. And but I also get to work with graduate students, which I love too. The first graduate student I co-advised just turned in her thesis yesterday, which is the last day to do it for this semester. So she was really pushing the deadline, but she turned it in. It was really great. And so I work with students. I do sometimes teach. I am co-teaching a class this semester, and then the university does supplement my salary because I have a part-time lecturer appointment. I think that's kind of the overview. This position, the research scientists and research faculty positions differ greatly from university to university. And in fact, so I'm in college engineering, and from what I hear, it's very different in college engineering than in LS&A. So, and I interviewed for different research scientist positions at other universities, at University of Texas. And unfortunately, I landed in this position at U of M, but what I found out later is actually that position is very different. It's not considered faculty, which is actually the case in some universities. It's not considered faculty, it's a staff position, which sometimes means you can't have your own grants, you can't have your own students. So the position at Michigan is fantastic, and it gives you a lot of flexibility and freedom. So I think that's all.
Thank you. I'm Naomi Silver, and I'm the Associate Director of the Sweetland Center for Writing. That's a position that is roughly 70% administrative, and then I also have a 30% faculty position as a lecturer 4 at the university. And basically my role involves helping to oversee and run all aspects of the writing programs and the Writing Center here at Michigan. So helping with the one-on-one work that we do with students on their writing, and training the peer tutors who work in our peer tutoring centers, but it also means working with faculty and graduate students who are teaching first-year writing requirement courses, and working with the college administration to oversee those courses, and to work with faculty who are developing upper-level writing requirement courses. So it's a lot of and I teach one course a semester as part of that as well. So I work with undergraduate students in my courses. I work with graduate students as GSIs, so doing training sessions for them in their units, but then also we teach a course on teaching writing. So I teach graduate students to teach writing, and then also work with graduate students in various other ways on writing projects they do and other kinds of writing-related activities that they're involved in. And then a lot of my work is working with faculty and doing professional development with faculty in similar ways to CRLT, but specifically focused around writing, but then also helping faculty to develop courses, even with faculty who are not teaching writing intensive courses, but who have a paper or interested in incorporating writing into their courses, helping them to do that more effectively. So it's a hybrid job in a lot of ways. I get to do a lot of teaching, but I also do a lot of more administrative type work, overseeing the center and doing professional development with our own faculty. We have 20 faculty who teach writing at the university, but then also work within our writing center, and I do reviews of them. And then finally, we have a research component as well. We do a lot of research on student writing and student development of writing, and so I'm engaged in several collaborative sort of social science type projects related to that. So that's what I do.
Great, thanks. I'm Melanie Boyd. I work at Yale, and I have a sort of, I'm thinking that I'm like maybe the farthest stretch in some ways in terms of faculty. I am an instructor in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, and I teach there as often as I can. At the moment, that's turning out to be about once every other year. And I am a dean, and that used to be my primary appointment, that I was an instructor. I went to Yale as a trailing spouse. I was on the job market for 5 years with my partner, and every year we moved slightly farther apart from each other, and then finally we said, like, whatever our best deal is at the end of this year, we are going to take. And so he got a tenure track job, and I got negotiated in as a lecturer position. My work, what has been interesting for me is that I've always been very involved in sort of the service work of how is a department functioning, how is the university functioning in different ways. My own research is on, my degree is from the University of Michigan in English and Women's Studies, and my research is on sexual violence. And this is something that campuses really struggle with, rates of sexual violence amongst undergraduates, in particular sexual harassment amongst graduate students and faculty. And so I've ended up having, kind of think of it as my sort of faculty position has gone rogue a little bit, because I have gotten the job of taking on how does the university figure out how to tackle that. So I spend huge amounts of time teaching in all kinds of non-classroom settings. So I'm teaching our board of trustees some of the things they need to know, and our president, and I'm teaching the incoming freshmen. I run all sorts of different groups of student educators and leaders. One of the things that's been really, it shouldn't have been surprising, but has been important to me, is that some of the teaching that I do is around the content of the sexual violence work, but a lot of the teaching that I do is teaching about teaching about pedagogy, right? There's a lot, at least in this area, there's a strong belief, well, if we just put everyone in the room and tell them the facts, that will solve the problem. And that doesn't work in so many different ways, and I go back to some of the things I learned as a graduate student in Sweetland, in all other kinds of classroom settings, of how do you actually make learning happen and make students sort of move along down an intellectual, practical, how do you teach skills, how do you teach concepts? That those are things that now that I spend much of my time with people who are administrators but who are not faculty, that I feel more like a faculty person than ever. So I always, and it's funny to people because my dean position so outranks, at least within the hierarchies of Yale, so outranks my lecturer position that people are always hiding the fact that I'm a lecturer, and I'm always introduce myself first as saying that I teach in WJSS as my primary location, because I do feel like what I'm doing is continuing to teach all of the time. Mm-hmm. So I can say a whole lot more about it, but to some extent I'm hanging on to my faculty position in part as much as a piece of my self-presentation in my institutional setting as anywhere else.
Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Rainberg. I'm about the exact opposite of a research scientist in the College of Engineering. I am a lecturer 4, and I went and got my PhD so that I could teach. So PhD to do research, PhD to teach. Thankfully, the University of Michigan offers paths for both of us to take. Lecturers at Michigan, at least at the lecturer 4 level, tend to spend the majority of their time teaching. So I have an 80% teaching load, and the remaining 20% comes from doing service and various related activities. So I sit on a board for the first year computing in the College of Engineering. I do advising with students, and every once in a while I dip my toes into the research waters. But if I do, it's research with a little r, not a big R, like U of M has. And my research is focused on pedagogy and things like that. In particular, active learning, how to bring collaboration into the classroom, how to test skills in a programming course without actually testing programming type questions. So the types of research, that don't really result in big, huge discoveries, but they do result in an improvement in a classroom experience for my students. And I also spend a lot of time mentoring students on the side through UROP, which is the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program at U of M. And I take on a lot of students as independent studies to do mobile phone application development. Purely as sort of a side project. It's not a part of my appointment, but I do it to just stay plugged in with the student body and, keep myself sane from teaching the same classes every single semester.
So it sounds like we have a real range, as everyone can see on the panel, of responsibilities and teaching, research, and administration. I thought it would be interesting for folks to hear, and this might be hard to do in just a couple minutes, but to hear a little bit about your pathway into that position. And maybe, Jeff, if you want to start, and we can go in the reverse order, sort of how you ended up in that career path.
Yeah. So I started at U of M as an undergrad in 1996. Got a bachelor's in 2000. Wasn't ready to finish school yet, so I went into the master's program, College of Engineering. Halfway through, I realized that I still wasn't ready to be done yet, and I went and switched tracks to the PhD track. As I got too far into the PhD work, I realized that I really no longer liked research at all. But it was a means to an end because I lost my research funding, but I gained teaching funding as a GSI, grad student instructor, and discovered my true passion in life, which is to teach. And so I did that for a couple of semesters, with a great deal of stress with my advisor who wanted me to leave. But I wanted to stay, and develop a little bit more experience as a teacher. In fact, attending this exact workshop, the Preparing Future Faculty series. And then when I was very close to graduating, there was a lecturer position that opened up on an intermittent basis in the College of Engineering. I got it, I did really well. They kept me on as a lecturer one, I guess, as like the term by term lecturer. Mm-hmm. And then I made the decision that it would be nice to actually find a home. I was employed by the college at that time as opposed to a department. And so the folks in the college said, well, you can ask the EECS department, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, to see if they have a position. They did. And I just sort of went like that. And so it was really I just sort of was sitting in the boat and going for a ride and, realized some things about myself along the way. But none of these things I really actively had to pursue, which unfortunately for most of you is not the path that's going to be common. I just happened to find a lot of series of lucky pit stops along the way, I guess. Uh-huh. And now I'm here. So.
It's my sense that for everyone I know who has, remained employed in any way whatsoever, a whole series of lucky pit stops.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah,
luck is a huge percentage of it, right? So that some of it I do think is about figuring out what are the possibilities, recognizing that luck when it's sort of drifting along. I finished my PhD here in 2003. I taught here for a little while. I had a teaching postdoc, which we were just talking about, so it's very much on my mind at the last panel. And then, as I said, I went back to Yale. I had been an undergraduate there as a lecturer, and very much committed after a number of years of moving our family in different directions to finding a way to make it work that wasn't just continuing to apply for tenure track jobs elsewhere. I had gotten 2 tenure track jobs, neither of which were going to work well, and I can talk a bit about that, but so I turned jobs down. My partner turned jobs down as well. We needed something that would kind of work for all of us. And very much my goal when we arrived there was to figure out, how do I make a sort of vibrant life for myself here? And so some of that was, I was fortunate, I was in a very small department where there was not an overabundance of people willing and able to do any of the work. So there were plenty of places for me to dive in and be connected. I did this as a postdoc too, both as a postdoc and as a lecturer. I managed to just sort of, it's easier to do in some contexts than others, but I also think there can be a tendency to be like, well, the real faculty sit at that table, and then the other, and that you just keep engaging everybody in conversation and figure out what's going So for me, that, and the work that I was working on in the classroom kept spilling out into the quadrangles and the administrative halls. Yale, like a lot of other places, has routine, sort of high-profile things that pop up. Fraternities will do stuff, or, you know, other groups of people. And so I just sort of, more by fluke than anything else, kept finding myself in conversation with administrators and students of, like, what are we going to do about this? And eventually just said, look, if you want, I will work on solving this problem for you, but here's what I need, and wrote up a proposal, and they said, great. So that was a process of kind of figuring out that I did have some skills that would be of use to my university, and it took a few years for them to recognize that they needed help on it. They sort of kept pushing things down, because, which I think is what most people do. So that's not, I don't mean that as a criticism, it just, like, the stuff I work on is a bit unsavory at times, and so nobody really wants to deal with it. And so there was a degree of persistence in being around long enough and having enough small victories that people recognized that pivoting to deal with it was actually going to be more productive, and that it was possible. I mean, and there too, it felt very much like teaching. I mean, it was a kind of teaching, right? Teaching people to sort of see that there were new possibilities for how we handle things.
So my path is different yet again. I think we'll have very different paths. I got my PhD in comparative literature at UC Irvine, so in Southern California, though I'm from Detroit originally. And after I finished my PhD in 2001, I had a postdoc at UCLA in the English department, and then I taught in a humanities program for a couple years at UC Irvine. But those were, the postdoc was a one-year thing, and those were contingent jobs that I was applying for tenure track jobs at the same time. But when I came into grad school, luckily, things are better in this way now, but the very first thing that I did as a graduate student, before I even attended my first seminar, was to teach my first writing class of freshmen. So that was my support as a graduate student, was to teach in the writing program at UC Irvine. And we were kind of thrown into it without a whole lot of support. And then we took a class, like the next semester I had a pedagogy class. But it's much better here. You guys get a lot more training often before you're, and through CRLT, before you're in those positions. But consequently, by the time I finished my PhD program, I had a lot of experience teaching writing because I had done it all the way through. So when I went to apply for jobs, my main aim was to get a tenure track position in comparative literature, but there are not many of those around, even today. But I could also apply for writing jobs because I had a lot of experience writing, even though I hadn't studied writing, and I didn't have my degree in the field of writing. And at the time that I was applying for jobs, so early 2000s, that was pretty common, that many people teaching in writing programs there weren't a lot of PhDs available in rhetoric and composition. That's actually changed quite a bit. That's really a booming field at this point still. So I applied for both kinds of jobs, had some great on-campus visits and stuff for comparative literature jobs, and also actually Americanist jobs, because one of my areas was American literature. But then ended up being offered a job here at U of M in writing, so as a lecturer in the Sweetland Center for Writing, and chose to come back here for family reasons, also because my mom was here and was having some health issues. So there were, reasons to come back, even if this wasn't exactly the job that I was aiming for at that point. But found that so I came in as a lecturer, and found that as a lecturer, I also had a lot of time to continue the research in comparative literature that I was doing, and so remained active in comparative literature at the same time that I was teaching writing. But then in 2007, the current associate director of Sweetland ended up leaving, and that job opened up. And I had some opportunities while I was a lecturer to do administrative work. I'd served on the LSA curriculum committee, for instance, which is a college body which oversees curriculum decisions for the university, and had opportunities to get to know a number of different people. And since I'd also come in not in my own field, I wanted to make ties to people in literary studies here at U of M, and so I joined a lot of reading groups with people in American cultures and in English and in Comp Lit, and so made an effort to really get to know people around the campus and not just in my own unit. And in 2007, when this job opened up, I decided that I was ready for a different kind of challenge, and I wasn't at that point pursuing tenure track jobs in comparative literature because my family and I were pretty settled here, and my mom is here, et cetera. So I wanted to stay in Michigan. So I applied for that job, and that was a national search, but I did end up getting hired for that job in my own unit. And that was a big change because I went from being 100% faculty, teaching 3 courses a semester, one of which was one-on-one work and writing workshops, so essentially 2 courses a semester plus, to being 70% administrative in a busy unit that does a lot of work on campus. So at that point, my comparative literature research effectively ended, and I became a scholar of writing because that was a point where I had to kind of ramp up the ways that I was engaging and intersecting with the field of writing studies very differently. And also began a research agenda in writing studies because that was what part of my position entailed. So I would say, like, in the last 6 years, since beginning the administrative position, I've done kind of a career shift in a pretty major way. And at this point, now 6 years in, am really starting to publish in the field as well as, doing the teaching that I'd done all along. So, an interesting, for me, it's been an interesting shift to kind of embrace this new field that I'd always done in practice, but not really, I hadn't considered myself a scholar of, and now I'm much more in that. And we'll, continue in this. At some point, just as an aside, my husband has gone back to graduate school and will go on the market, actually, in education probably in a couple of years. And so then I'll have to consider, since I sort of ended up in this position, what sort of position I'm looking for then, and that will be an interesting moment, because it could be the tenure track position in writing, or it could be probably more likely a hybrid teaching and administrative position, because that tends to be fairly common in this field. So that's my path.
And mine, of course, is different. So let's see, I started grad school at U of M in the applied physics program in 2002. At that time, my fiance moved from a full-time job to Michigan, so we could get married and be together, be in the same place. Fast forward to 2009, I was finishing my PhD. We'd gotten married. We had a 2-year-old and 4-year-old. And the thought of moving for me to get a postdoc for a 2-year position somewhere just seemed utterly horrendous at that time. So we really, and my husband had gotten a job. He struggled for a while to find a job in Ann Arbor, but he ended up finding a job that he loves. And he was reluctant. He didn't really want to leave his job. We didn't want to leave Ann Arbor. So I did apply for jobs all over the country, and we kind of, felt we'd see what happened. And but then a position opened up in my department. Someone had gotten a large research grant, and they needed there was an opening for a research scientist. And I applied. They said it's kind of unlikely that I would get it because I hadn't done a postdoc, but I ended up getting it, and that was in 2009. And I've been there ever since. As far as kind of my path going forward, I'm not really sure where, I'm probably none of us are really sure of if we're going to have a next step or what it'll be, or if we'll stay here. I would love to stay in my position, but it is on grants, so it's kind of unclear, especially with the cuts in science funding. But yeah, I think that's my general path.
So it sounds like, I know, Melanie, you mentioned that there are points at which you turn down a tenure track position, and I think all of you have mentioned moments where you decided not to pursue such positions, and it sounds like in all of your cases, those who talked about that decision, there were personal life reasons that factored into that decision-making process. Are there other things that factored into that decision-making process, or what was that decision-making process like?
I felt so trained to look for and only value a tenure track job, that was what I was totally pointed towards. And I worried a great deal. The jobs that I turned down were clearly, to me at least, not viable. One of them involved department politics so dysfunctional that people were coming to my hotel room in the middle of the night as a job candidate to lobby me on different sides. It really, and I left that interview saying to them, like, here are all the things you have to fix in this department before anyone will take the job. And they were like, great, we're going to give it to you and you can come fix them. And I was like, yeah. But, you know, and so there are things, so I didn't turn anything down lightly, I will say, or without, I would have liked to have taken a tenure track job. I was very worried about the decision to stop looking, and about the decision to sort of take a lecturer position. I felt that it was really important for my family and that was the right thing to do. It seemed very clear that if I had managed to pull off the tenure track job and gotten my partner a lectureship, he would have, you know, so that the gender politics were complex for us, but it felt tenable, that it had been the luck of the draw. And I was very worried that not having this thing that I wanted, particularly while my partner had it and was doing it, was going to be one of those things that would like eat away at me over the next 20 years of my life. That has just not been true. At least for me, I've been able to find opportunities. I love the work that I'm doing. He is frequently miserable as a tenure track junior professor. Some of you will have seen him doing a good imitation of being cheery on that panel earlier today, but it's a hard thing, and there's like tons of scrutiny and expectations, and you're not in charge of your own time, and you're always trying to please all those people who are going to vote on your tenure. My life has been much simpler. You know, I deal with very volatile stuff, but I can really just deal with the people in the room in a much more direct way. So that's sort of not quite answering the question you asked, but I do think it's really important to believe that, and then we see these like horror stories of people who labor forever in adjunct positions and can never pay their rent, and you know that those get cast as the two alternatives, and it is just not like that. There are lots and lots of other possibilities of ways that people make their way through it, and so to not think of being off the tenure track as something that you only do under great duress, I think is really important. But I got there, I wasn't smart enough to have seen that in advance. I only know that because I'm on the other side.
I know that when I was starting out and deciding what I was going to do, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Sidney Finelli, who's the director of CRLT North, sent me down and said, you do know that if you pursue the path of a lecturer, you're essentially shutting the door to a tenure track position. And I said, yeah, but I don't care. Because a tenure track position to me was basically doing the research that I didn't enjoy at the end of my PhD and spending my whole time writing grants. Now, some people enjoy that, and more power to them, okay? They enjoy leading edge research, but when I sat back and thought, you know, what would I do with my life if I didn't have a job at U of M? I mean, the answer was really I'd be a high school teacher. And so when I thought about it that way, high school teachers, they don't have tenure. I mean, they have this sort of weird kind of tenure if they're there for 20 or 30 years, but it's not really the kind of tenure that exists in the university atmosphere. And I also didn't want to get stuck in a situation where I would bang my head against a wall trying to get tenure and then not get it, and have to go somewhere else and start all over again. Thankfully, the position of lecturer at U of M, there are different kinds, and the lecturer path exists for whatever reason, you know, due to the union or whatever. There are also adjunct lecturers at U of M, which, in my opinion, I think is a tragedy to education. The fact that these adjunct positions exist. You know, a couple $1,000 to teach a class, which doesn't really result in anything for the person's career. It's almost an insult to the education that's being taught by the person in that position, not an insult to the person, but to the education that's being delivered. Because I think that at the level of the University of Michigan, you have to value the people who are teaching the courses. And to say that this person is only worth a couple $1,000s to teach a class to a lot of times an incredibly large number of underclassmen is delivering a wrong message. Now, these types of positions don't typically occur in the College of Engineering. The College of Engineering is very good to their lecturers. But I do know in other parts on in other departments on campus, those positions are quite common. So I struggled with that decision of, could I end up in that position of potentially being a perpetual adjunct? And if that was the case, I wouldn't do that. I would just go and teach high school or something. But it was definitely a decision that I had to think about for a while. And for those of you who don't know, the lecturer 4 position at U of M has this sort of, it's not really tenure, but it's sort of a contract that gets renewed every 5 years. And if you go under a major review after each one of these times, and if you don't pass your major review, you're given an entire year to try to pass it again. And if you don't pass it again, you're given another year to essentially get out. So it's kind of like not passing tenure. You go from, except you have to go up for tenure every 5 years, which if this were a perfect world wouldn't happen either. It'd be great if we offered tenure to our lecturers. And at a place like U of M, you know, politics come into play. But you know, personally, I think that if you're at U of M, you would expect both the research and the teaching to be at a top-notch level. But you know, that's the way it is at U of M.
So your response kind of gets a little bit at my next question, which is, do you all feel it makes a difference that your position isn't defined as tenure track? And, you know, what are the rewards or challenges of some of those differences?
Yeah, I would say, so I am a lecturer for, and there's now this new thing called continuing renewal review, which is just, so that is actually a smaller review that after you've passed like 2 major reviews. But it is, unless you do something really horrible once you've been renewed at least once, you're pretty much going to stay in that position. If you're, you know, if you're doing a good job, it's obviously, and you know, your department makes a difference. Sweetland cares a lot about teaching and having its faculty be good teachers. So, but in terms of whether it makes a difference, in my position, since a lot of it is administrative, I'm not expected to be tenure track, right? I'm doing administrative work in the unit and running the unit. And Sweetland is an unusual unit in that it is a unit of lecturers. The only tenured faculty member in the unit is our director, Ann Gear. And that position changes, you know, every 5 years or so, and it's always a tenured person in that position, but everyone else is a lecturer. So what that means is that there are the kind of hierarchies that can exist in many departments where you have lecturers as well as other, you know, tenured line faculty teaching, and where lecturers, you know, often, not always, it depends on the culture of the institution, may feel like second-class citizens, and especially if adjunct lecturers who are not necessarily given, you know, offices or whatever. So Mike's coming here, taking a lecturer position at Michigan felt very different from taking a lecturer position at many other universities. And I didn't look at a lot of lecturer positions at other universities because they tend not to come with very much, or, you know, they were much more contingent. They didn't have the kind of opportunities, you know, at Michigan lecturers can apply for almost all of the same kinds of grants that faculty can, through CRLT, for instance, wonderfully, and, you know, can do a lot of, have a lot of the same opportunities that tenure line faculty do, not all opportunities, but a lot of the same. So I would say for the most part, it's not a problem at all that I'm not a tenure track faculty, and that I don't, if I do think of it, it's in a positive way, that like, oh, I don't, you know, I'm involved in an active research agenda, and I care about it, and I'm publishing, but I don't need to worry about getting my book out so that I can get tenure. You know, that I can define my research agenda, say, on its own terms, that I'm not having to do the same kind of jumping through hoops all the time that certainly a junior faculty person has to do often. Where it is a problem is frankly sometimes in terms of working with other faculty on campus. This is an issue with writing studies in general though, that at many universities, you may know this, writing studies, you know, is often a thing a lot of students have to do, that or is required of all students, that a lot of adjunct faculty teach, and it may, you know, overall, especially from faculty and literature departments, because those often go together, be seen as, you know, less serious than literary research. People in education departments feel differently, you know. So there are those kinds of hierarchies just in the field at large, which I would say have undergone a fair amount of change also in the last several years. But when I, you know, got my PhD when I started, that was much sharper, I think, overall. So sometimes then working with faculty, the fact that I'm not a tenure track faculty member potentially it means that I have to work harder sometimes in order to, you know, well, I was going to say in order to be granted the same respect, but then on the other hand, because I have an administrative position, And Sweetland does have power in that we approve courses that faculty teach and we give GSIs. You know, it can be a funny sort of power play sometimes. But I would say that that's not most of the time at all. And that most of the time, I think the fact that as an administrator and as a lecturer, as a faculty member in that sense, I have such a wide variety of things that I'm able to do and work on, it makes my job just really interesting. And so that's a very positive element of it.
I'd say I'd agree. In my day-to-day life, it really doesn't make a difference at all. My department's really unique in that half of our faculty are research faculty and half are tenure track faculty, which is not the case. Most of the research faculty in the university are in the college engineering, but our department by far has the most. And so I get to vote on everything that the faculty vote on, except for tenure cases. So we have a say in everything. We have a say in the curriculum. Admitting students. So I'd say it really doesn't make a difference. Sometimes, and like I said, I can be a PI in a grant, I can co-advise students. I think sometimes people often will get confused about, people from the outside who aren't familiar with this type of position will get confused about, well, I'm confused why you're at a university but you're not tenured. Or you're not on the tenure track, but and that's obviously a really small issue. So I'd say it really doesn't make a difference. And there is the issue of having job security once you have tenure. My husband always laughs at me because he's in the private sector where they get charge codes every 4 months, and then so you find out at the end of 4 months if you have a job for another 4 months. So to him, the fact that I have these 3-year-long grants, he thinks it's ridiculous that I would ever be like, oh no, I don't have tenure. But to him, to people in the private sector and in industry where things are much more volatile, it's not that big a deal.
I just want to mirror a couple of those points. Don't get me wrong, I love my job. And U of M, being a lecturer here is fantastic. You get your summers off, teach 3.5 months a semester. It's a fantastic position, but there is always that underlying feeling that you're not tenure track. And I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation right now sort of stresses that point. And there are subtle little things that happen every once in a while. I have the same sort of voting rights in my department. I can pretty much vote on anything that I want. I can propose new curriculum, all that kind of stuff. But there are certain things here that lecturer or faculty are not allowed to get. If you go to I think CRLT maintains a list of awards that are given out by the university, and if you look at the credentials for the majority of the awards, they're for tenure track faculty. And there's, I think, only one, at least in the College of Engineering, that is specifically earmarked for lecturers or non-tenure track faculty. And the monetary values that are assigned to the lecturer versus the tenure track ones are significantly different. So there is a difference there. Even though I do have the ability to be a PI and I can vote on most things and so on and so forth, there's an undercurrent, right? It's not right there out in the open, and I feel respected in my position, and I feel like I'm a peer amongst equals and so on and so forth. But there is always that subtle difference between myself and a tenure track faculty member. And even the fact that I have to say that I'm non-tenure track sometimes. The fact that I have to say it means that there's something there.
And I think it's different I'm sure it's different at different universities. I know my position is that I have talked to other research scientists who, and probably lecturers feel the same way, they do feel like second-class citizens. They feel really different. So I would think, if you're going to another university, find out kind of what the climate is for the position you're looking for, which is something I didn't do at all, and I just really lucked out getting this position.
And some of that is university level, and some of that will be departmental level.
Yeah, that's true,
Program
too.
level, right? That it can change.
I do think it's different in college engineering and in LSSA. LSNA, I think it's really different.
Or even in, WGSS, like my training is in English and women's studies, but as a lecturer in women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale, I was fully integrated into everything. At the English department at Yale, the lecturers are very much not part of the life of the department. It's a much bigger department. They kind of don't need those people to be part of the table. So that it changes quite a bit depending on what you're looking
Yeah, so basically, wherever you go, you need to really research that. If you're going non-tenure track, you need to find people in those positions and talk to them and get the real story.
I
Because it's
also-
different everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But even, as you were saying, I think I've, visited other departments, and department politics is really different, and different universities and different politics, so you really need to know what you're getting into. Someone
is
once said to
true.
me, someone said that each department everywhere has their own unique set of mental illnesses. I mean, it's just, it's really different, and it can make your career great, or it can make your job great, and it can really be a struggle for some people.
Right, and that is true.
Everywhere.
Tenure track.
Exactly,
or
yeah,
whatever
right,
you do.
yeah.
Regardless.
I would also say, and I know that CRLT does other work on this, and that the confines of this panel are thinking about faculty, being in a faculty position off the tenure track, but that it does often, I think people end up feeling boxed in around, well, you're supposed to get a tenure track faculty position,
Yeah.
and then if you don't, your next best thing is something that looks like that, even if it's not tenure track, and that maybe you tell people and maybe you don't, maybe you just kind of let it slide. But there are so many things. I'm now, I don't know, 10 years out, and my colleagues my cohort have gone on to do so many different kinds of things. And so I think not feeling like, that one of the things that can make lectureships feel terrible is they feel like it's the only thing left after you've failed at the thing you were supposed to do. And so knowing that there are plenty of people who are making conscious choices about it is good, and also knowing that there are just millions of other things that people do is really important, even if what you're doing is being in a lectureship, to know that you're there because that job is going to bring certain rewards and let you use certain skills, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah, and in humanities fields too, with especially I think in the area of digital humanities and sort of growing areas there, that there are a lot of people who are working within the university but not in a teaching position. And so that, that those are other ways of, if being, and not only that, I mean, certainly, in the library and CRLT and in many other places, there are very rich, intellectually rewarding and personally rewarding jobs that don't look like a tenure track job in many ways at all, but may, as you were saying, involve a lot of teaching, but in other kinds of fora as well, and the opportunity potentially for research, et cetera.
So I want to open it up to you all. We have about 25 minutes. I see a hand here and then a hand over here, so maybe first you and then you.
Okay. I once read, I think, at least historically in the long history of academia, that the purpose of tenure was for professors to have the ability to be a little bit more creative and risky and not worry about, it gives you that some added flexibility. So in non-tenure track positions, I'm from College of Engineering, so I guess thinking in that context, like, can you create new classes? Can you start new initiatives, like programs for students, like extracurricular activities for students? Things like, do you have more or less ability, you think, than if you were in a tenure track position or already tenured, for example, versus a position that you hold now?
Well, it's interesting, the comparison, right? Our intellectual freedom, right, may be in some ways less than someone who's in a tenured position, but in other ways maybe more than someone who's in a tenure track position, right? That we're not necessarily being scrutinized in the same ways. I don't know what other people think.
Well, I've actually heard the same thing that you said about why tenure exists. And, I don't have a lot of scrutiny placed on what I teach, but I'm also not given a lot of flexibility for what I teach. Lecturers are oftentimes pigeonholed into different classes that need people to teach them, and they're frequently the ones that tenure track faculty don't want to teach. Thankfully, those are the kind of classes that I like to teach. In other words, gigantically huge underclassmen. 225 to 450 students in a classroom. And in that scope, I have a certain set of things that I have to teach. But I do have some flexibility in there to explore different avenues for active learning and different types of ways to teach the material that I do. But would I like the opportunity to have a tenure-like system so that I could go off and do some more interesting stuff like researching flipping the classroom and all sorts of other things? Absolutely. Why doesn't that exist? I don't know. You'd think that lecturers would be the professional teachers and tenure track would be the professional researchers with a little bit of teaching thrown in. You know, why doesn't the tenure exist for both? Some schools it does, but at U of M it doesn't. But I do have the capacity or the flexibility to do those types of things if I want to. And my department thankfully gives me the opportunity to take on a lot of independent study students as well, to do the types of things that you're talking about. So I hosted one time over 50 students doing an independent study one semester, which was bigger than a lot of classrooms that some people teach, right? And this was just a side project that I was doing and just overseeing the things that they do. And so I do have the flexibility, but it's a different model flexibility.
Yeah, I'd say I have a ton of flexibility. I can write my own grants, so I can direct where my research goes. Obviously, if I'm part of my salary is on someone else's grant, I have to do what that grant, the goal of that grant. But it's my choice to be on someone else's grant, or to devote my time to that. I could develop new courses. I'm involved in a lot of service in the college and in our department, working with students, which is something I really enjoy doing. I am a UROP faculty supervisor, so I work with undergrads on research projects that are my choice. I think I have a ton of flexibility.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the department you're in and the school that you're in. So that's going to make a difference. So Sweetland being a unit of lecturers, we rely on our lecturers to develop curriculum and to be innovative in that way and to do, we need them to do the things that in many other departments tenure line faculty would be doing. And so, that's a different kind of balance sometimes for them. But we have the opportunity as a unit to develop a lot of new courses, and faculty are really encouraged to put out ideas and to help in that development. But that's not the same for lecturers, certainly in every department on campus. It really is going to depend. And I think that, Jeff, what Jeff was saying is absolutely right, that often lecturers, are filling in for certain kinds of courses. But also, if you have a longer-term lecturer appointment, that can evolve as well. So I think that say, lecturers in the English department, where many of the lecturers are teaching the writing classes, lecturers who have been there longer and who have been renewed a few times are given the opportunity to work with upper-level students and and teach a range of kinds of courses there. Not necessarily develop their own courses, I don't think, but so there is variation there. But I would say in terms of intellectual freedom, that has never been an issue as a lecturer. That there's never, no one has ever scrutinized the kind of work that I'm doing on that level, and probably, as Melanie was pointing out, less so than if I were in a junior faculty position.
I will say that having become an administrator, there's no intellectual freedom as an administrator, right? You are suddenly part of the institution, right? And so I can only say things that 15 other people or maybe 40 other people, depending on the topic, have agreed with me are the right thing to be said. So that also has given me a new angle on freedoms that I took for granted as a lecturer that are now gone. So it's another piece of it.
Yeah.
I'd also make a quick point that the fact that I don't have tenure sometimes is a good thing because it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah,
right? I know
true.
that if I drop the ball for a couple of semesters in a row, that's going to negatively impact my next review. And so I do have to make sure that I always maintain a certain bar of excellence, which I would do regardless of tenure or not. But still, there is it doesn't allow you to get lax. So that's,
How are you, what's your evaluation? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I know we had a question here, and then maybe we can get to the how people are evaluated.
So my question is mostly for those of you who still do research and apply for grants for that research. I'm in the biological sciences, so it's, right now trying to get a grant, even if you are a well-funded lab that has a tenure track faculty member, seems really difficult. Is it all that much harder when you can't say you're a tenure track faculty or?
So I think I'll take that, but I think it depends. I've heard it's very different I actually think it's harder for biology because I think that I don't know if it's NIH or NSF, limits the amount of time in months that you can put. You can put on like 2/9 of your salary or something. You can basically cover your summer salary. So in which case it would be impossible. I mean, you'd have to get all these grants to cover your full salary. So it's different per funding institution. Most of my funding comes out of Department of Energy, and they're fine with me writing a grant that says I want to cover my salary, money for an experiment, and 2 grad students. So it just depends. But my salary does come from multiple grants but all are doing similar work.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask in terms of evaluation if people wanted to share how they're evaluated.
Well, I have to go under a major, not a major review. It's written into the LEO contract. It's called a faculty activity report. And basically you just list the classes that you taught, you put down your Q1 and Q2 scores from the evaluations. You talk about what your 3 goals are for the upcoming year, what the 3 goals from the previous year were and how you achieved them and things. And talk about, what types of service roles you did. It's basically just a report card at the end of the year that needs to be, passed. But every 5 years or so you go under a major review, which is a much larger thing where feedback is solicited from other faculty and from students and so on and so forth. And the LEO contract has, or at least it used to, I don't know what happened over the summer with the right to work law, but there used to be mandated pay increases for every annual review and then a different increase in pay for a major review and then each successful major review. But the nice thing about this that helps to bring a sense of fairness to the department is that tenure track faculty have these reports as well. They have annual reports that they have to submit for their teaching and for their research. And in a sense, theirs is scrutinized a lot more highly than mine because they have to talk about how much money they brought into the department and all this kind of stuff. So I just have to worry about, teaching primarily and doing a really good job at it.
At Yale, the lecturer annual self-review is the same as the tenure track self-review. I know because we were often doing them side by side, and there is an expectation that you're doing research as well. The level of scrutiny that is brought to bear and the kind of how long your answers have to be changes. And then we have either there are 1-year appointments, 3-year appointments, and 5-year appointments. And so when your appointment is up, there's not a whole lot of scrutiny at the 1 year because they're not dealing with you in the thing they renew you for is a year, so they don't really care all that much. If you're in the 3-year and the 5-year cycles, there's more scrutiny at those phases. And then in my administrator wing of my life, there's a whole, I'm about to embark on this where 15 of my colleagues have to write small essays about whether or not they think I'm bringing valuable things to the college and what I'm like to work with. And so that's a whole other piece that I wasn't, I'm used to these sort of self-reports, and this is a much more collaborative process.
Yeah, so the faculty part of my review is pretty similar to what Jeff described, but that there are different types of lecturers. There's lecture 1, lecture 2, which is sort of one track, and lecture 3, lecture 4, which is a different track, and there are sort of different expectations of what work you do at those levels. So the lecture 1, 2 position is really only teaching, and then 3, 4 is teaching and service, and then the research work is 4 lectures additional there. But it is this, these annual reports, which are the same as the faculty turn in Sweetland, and then we have a lot of faculty that are co-appointed with English, and they do the same annual reports as the faculty in English do. And then these 5-year reviews where someone comes to visit your class and write up, reports about the teaching observation. And then, so that is one thing that is different for lecturers than for tenure-line faculty because they do not have people visit their classes, that they're evaluated on their teaching through student evaluations and other forms as well, but not in terms of observations. And and then we write up a teaching philosophy and sort of put together a whole dossier of the teaching that we've done. So that's for, again, the teaching part of my position. And then for the administrative part, every single year I do this self-evaluation where basically I list, in some ways it's very useful to see just how busy you've been in a given year, but I have to list basically everything I've done in all these different areas of my job. And and there's actually very little room given for reflection on what you've done and trying to put things together and thinking about it. It's more sort of, what tasks have you done that fit with the different areas of your job that, have been determined and will evolve in various ways. And so they're very different processes, and I prefer the evaluation of my teaching because it actually prompts me to think about my practice and to, to put things together a bit more rather than simply accounting for my time in certain ways.
I also have a yearly questionnaire self-evaluation that's exactly the same as the tenure track faculty. My position is actually, it's a limited appointment in the sense that it has ranks just like tenure track. So I'm a assistant research scientist, there's associate and full. There's also a separate track that we haven't talked about at Michigan called the research professor track, and that has an associate professor and full professor, research professor. That track is for researchers who, or research scientists who have more independent research, have a more independent research group. And actually, our department has several full research professors who essentially, have their own. They're the head of their own research group and just bring in all the money for their salary and all the students. But just like tenure track, my position, it's up and out. I have 7 years to get promoted, or my term ends.
So I saw a hand over here and then over there.
Okay, so I think that a lot of us have sort of come into the idea that the tenure track is like this unidirectional arrow shooting forth, and you're either on it or you're not, right? And what I really appreciate about this panel is that you've all been talking about these sort of varying paths to careers that make sense for your own lives. Are you getting a sense that, given this rotten climate that we all know about, this job climate, that there's more lateral mobility within the university structure? Is there more space to, Naomi brought up the idea of like going back into a tenure market, or, moving back and forth, or to go and do this kind of work, or take time out and then get lectureship after that. Are these kinds of moves becoming possible, more possible? Are we seeing is there a change that's happening?
I don't know.
Yeah, to make a generalization would be hard, but I think I think it really does depend on the kind of position you're in and what various institutions are seeking. I've actually seen a lot of people do lateral moves off the tenure track within the university. So moving from one unit in the university to another, say from getting a PhD in English and then becoming part of the library structure, and then moving into the publishing wing, which is connected to the library. That's sort of one route. So in my own case, because I have sort of started this second, research agenda, I would be in a position to apply for tenure track jobs, but that really is dependent on the fact that I have publications and grants and stuff in that area. So it would be like, I actually don't know if I would be applying. I would probably be applying for assistant professorships, but not necessarily. I think it would depend on the school, because I've been at it long enough to be at the associate professor rank. So that's a somewhat unusual thing, I think, to kind of. But then on the other hand, there are people who work in industry who then certainly get lectureships and potentially, if they're doing research, can get tenure track positions too. And so, I think there is more flexibility than we tend to think, but a lot of it is looking out for the openings and sort of, becoming aware of what's out there and getting to know people, I think, so that you find out. And then new positions open. So the Humanities Institute just created a position for like an associate director of that institute who's working with digital humanities. And so that is kind of a nice new non-tenure track position for doing pretty interesting intellectual work, as an example. So I think that does exist. But moving straight back and forth, I would say, is harder.
So I know there was a question over here, and then I think we'd have time for one last question.
Yeah, so I'm currently a master's student right now, but I do know that, my passion is to particularly work with students in the future, because I felt so much impact from my professors here, and I wanted to continue that by becoming a teacher or a mentor in the future. And I also know that I don't really want to do research, but I've heard from a lot of faculty members that, even if you want to become a lecturer, you still need that credibility through a PhD program.
Mhm.
But the thought of, having to subject myself to research for 4 to 8 years seems really laborious to me. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. What options do people like me have?
So I know one option, so one thing to know is that, for example, in the community college sector, 71%, I know because I'm facilitating the panel on community college faculty next, of their faculty, their highest degree attainment is master's degree. And so it might be worth exploring, whether there are university level instructional opportunities other than at a place like Michigan where degree attainment, so your advisor may be right that that's the case for lecturers at U of M, but that's not necessarily the case at other institutional contexts. So, but I'd love to hear what other panelists think. That's just one thought.
This might not directly answer your question, but I will say there's a lot of different ways to work with students, and it's not just standing up in front of a classroom and lecturing. And I get a lot of fulfillment from advising graduate students. And when I was a graduate student, how I found out that I really like this is actually my advisor had a UROP program, and I advised I mentored a lot of undergraduates through UROP, which actually I still continue to do. So I think there are a lot of different ways to work with students, and so maybe keep that in mind.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question, and I would just ask you all, when you have time in the last couple minutes, to fill out the purple evaluation form for this session to just give us feedback on what was helpful for you. But Phil, I can actually read your name tag. What's your question?
Well, my question is really mainly for Caroline. So I am in molecular biology, so I'm familiar with research assistant positions and stuff. Our contexts, like I think you said, are a little bit different as far as funding. But I was just struck by the fact that you're describing your position, and it sounds like 7 and out. You're getting your own research funding. You have graduate students. Where's the advantage for you? Because I see the advantage for the university. They don't have to worry about paying for you ever. But where's the advantage for you? Because you're doing all the work of a professor that would be on tenure track, as far as I can tell from this. So
I get that question a lot, actually. Why don't I just go on the tenure track? And it's not, I don't think that door is closed for me. It's something that in the future I might do that if the right position at the right university comes up. But I have a lot of flexibility now in my position. I don't have to teach one class this semester. I can teach if I want to, have the department supplement some of my salary. So right now, I'm really enjoying the flexibility of this position. I would love to stay in this position if it's possible, but it's something in the future I might consider to look at tenure track positions as well.
Well, thank you. I want to just thank all of our panelists for sharing about their career paths and their thoughts on how they've been successful off the tenure track. We have just a couple minutes remaining on the next session.